There are things you can learn that will permanently change how you see every conversation, every news headline, every claim to authority. The strange part isn't that this knowledge exists. It's that most of it has been hiding in plain sight, waiting in old books and obscure papers that almost no one thinks to read. Level 1. The headline. Illusion. Let's start with something simple. When you read a headline that says, "Study shows X causes Y," there's a very high chance the study showed no such thing. What it likely showed was a correlation observed once in a specific population under specific conditions. But correlation is not causation, and journalists know that study finds possible. Link between X and Y in limited sample doesn't get clicks. So the language gets compressed, the uncertainty gets stripped away, and by the time it reaches you, it sounds like settled science. This isn't a conspiracy, it's just how information degrades as it moves through systems that reward simplicity over accuracy. Once you notice this pattern, you'll see it everywhere, and you'll stop trusting headlines the way you used to. Or two. Level 2. The myth of a stable self. Most people believe they have a fixed identity, a stable self that persists across time. But researchers have observed something strange. When people are asked to describe their personality, their values, or their preferences, the answers change depending on the context in which the question is asked. You're not quite the same person at work as you are at home. You're not the same person when you're hungry as when you're fed. The self is not a thing. It's more like a process, constantly adjusting to circumstance. Philosophers since David Hume have suggested this, but we still speak and think as if we have a core essence. Recognizing that identity is fluid doesn't make you less real. It just makes you more honest about what you are. Level 3. The feeling of knowing. Here's a question almost no one asks. Why do we assume that what feels true is true? The sensation of certainty is produced by your brain as a kind of signal, a shorthand for "stop questioning this." But that signal can be triggered by repetition, by emotional intensity, by social reinforcement, or by nothing at all. You've probably had the experience of being absolutely certain about something, only to discover later that you were completely wrong. The feeling didn't correlate with reality. It was just a feeling. Yet we treat certainty as if it's evidence. We let it end conversations, settle debates, guide decisions. Once you separate the feeling of knowing from actual knowledge, a lot of rigid thinking starts to soften. Level 4. Memory is a draft, not an archive. Most of what you remember never happened the way you remember it. Memory is not a recording, it's a reconstruction. And every time you recall something, you're rebuilding it from fragments, filling in gaps with assumptions, with later. Knowledge, with things other people told you. Studies on eyewitness testimony have shown this repeatedly. People confidently remember details that were never there. They misattribute sources. They blend events together. And because the memory feels vivid, they're convinced it's accurate. This doesn't mean your memories are worthless. It just means they're not evidence in the way you think they are. Treat them as drafts, not archives. Level 5. Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is widely misunderstood. Most people think it means that incompetent people are overconfident. That's partly true, but the more interesting part is the other side. Highly competent people often underestimate their own skill because they assume tasks that feel easy to them must be easy for everyone. They lack the reference point to recognize their own expertise. So you end up with a strange inversion. The people who know the least are the most certain, and the people who know the most are full of doubt. If you find yourself feeling uncertain about things you've studied for years, that's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign you're beginning to understand how much you don't know. Level 6. Language is a lens. Language shapes perception in ways that are hard to notice from inside the language you speak. Some languages have no future tense. Speakers of those languages have been found to save more money and make more future-oriented decisions, possibly because the grammar doesn't linguistically separate the present from what's coming. Other languages have elaborate spatial orientation systems that require speakers to constantly track cardinal directions. Speakers of those languages consistently outperform others on spatial reasoning tasks. You're not just using language to describe the world. Language is quietly shaping what you notice, what you remember, and how you think. You can't step outside it, but you can become aware that it's there, framing everything. Level 7. Behavioral Economics. Most economic models assume people are rational actors making optimal decisions based on available information. But behavioral economists have spent decades documenting how wildly this misses reality. People are loss-averse. They overvalue things they own. They're influenced by irrelevant anchors. They prefer a sure small gain over a probabilistically better, uncertain gain. Thinkers like Daniel Kahneman have shown that humans reliably make irrational choices, and not just in edge cases. This means that entire systems built on the assumption of rationality, markets, policies, institutions, are built on a false model of human behavior. They work despite the model, not because of it. And when they fail, it's often because the model was wrong from the start. Level 8. Health is wealth, but also knowledge. Here's something most people never consider. The food you eat changes the bacteria in your gut, and those bacteria produce neurotransmitters that affect your mood, your focus, your anxiety levels. Your gut is sometimes called a second brain, and it's in constant communication with the brain in your skull. What this means is that your mental state is not purely psychological. It's biological, microbial, chemical. A bad mood might not be about your thoughts at all. It might be about what you ate 2 days ago. This doesn't reduce the mind to biology. It just means the boundary between mind and body is far more blurred than we were taught. You're not a ghost in a machine. You're a process that includes the machine. Level Prafo. Attention as a battleground. Most people treat their attention as if it's free and infinite. But attention is a resource, and it's being harvested at scale. Every app, every website, every platform is designed using insights from psychology and neuroscience to hold your gaze as long as possible. Infinite scroll, autoplay, variable rewards. These aren't accidents, they're deliberate designs based on the same principles that make slot machines addictive. The cost isn't just time, it's cognitive. Your capacity for deep focus, for boredom, for sustained thought, atrophies when it's not used. Once you see your attention as a resource that others are competing to extract, you start to guard it differently. Level 10. Settled science. Here's a pattern you'll start to notice. Whenever someone says, "the science is settled," they're usually not talking about science. Science is a process, not a conclusion. It's a method for asking questions, testing ideas, revising beliefs in light of evidence. The moment someone invokes science as a final authority to shut down inquiry, they're doing something else. They're using the prestige of science as a rhetorical weapon. This doesn't mean all claims are equally valid. It means that the appeal to settled science is often a sign that the conversation has left the domain of curiosity and entered the domain of power. Real science welcomes questions. It's built on them. Level 11. You see what you expect. Most people assume that seeing is believing, but the reverse is closer to the truth. Believing is seeing. Your expectations shape your perception at a neurological level. If you're told a wine is expensive, you'll rate it as tasting better, and brain scans show increased activity in areas associated with pleasure. If you expect pain, the same stimulus will hurt more. This isn't placebo in the dismissive sense. It's evidence that perception is not passive reception, it's active construction. Your brain is constantly predicting what it's about to experience, and it uses those predictions to filter and interpret sensory data. You don't see the world as it is. You see the world as you expect it to be, adjusted slightly by incoming evidence. Level 12. The Algorithmic Filter. Here's a troubling thought. Most of the information you encounter has been filtered before it reaches you. Not by sensors, necessarily, but by algorithms designed to maximize engagement. The posts you see, the videos recommended to you, the search results that appear first, all of this is shaped by predictions about what will keep you clicking. The effect is subtle. You're not being told what to think. You're being shown a version of reality that's been optimized for your attention. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. You see more of what you've already engaged with. Your view narrows without you noticing. The solution isn't to abandon technology. It's to remember that the information environment you inhabit is not neutral. It's shaped, and you need to account for that. Level 13. Placebo. The placebo effect is real, measurable, and powerful, and that should bother you more than it does. In clinical trials, people given sugar pills often improve. Their pain decreases, their depression lifts, their symptoms resolve. Not because the pill did anything, but because they believed it would. This tells us that belief itself has physiological effects. The mind can trigger healing processes, release endorphins, modulate immune responses, all without any pharmaceutical intervention. Western medicine has mostly treated this as noise, something to control for. But what if it's signal? What if the mind's ability to influence the body is one of the most underutilized tools in health? We've dismissed it because it doesn't fit the model. But the model might be incomplete. Level 14. The divided self. Most people think they know what they want, but when researchers observe behavior, a strange gap appears. People say they value health, then eat poorly. They say they want connection, then scroll alone for hours. They say they want meaningful work, then optimize for salary. The stated preference and the revealed preference don't match. This isn't hypocrisy. It's evidence that the self is not unified. Different systems in the brain want different things. The part of you that plans is different from the part that acts in the moment. And the part that narrates your life afterward, the part that says, I want X, is often just guessing. You are not one coherent agent. You're a coalition, and the factions don't always agree. Level 15. Common sense is local. Here's a simple observation with deep implications. Most of what you think of as common sense is cultural. It feels universal because everyone around you shares it, but step outside your culture and it evaporates. The idea that individuals should pursue personal happiness, that time is money, that direct communication is virtuous, these are not human universals. They're specific to certain places and times. Other cultures organize life around completely different assumptions, and those assumptions feel just as obvious to the people living inside them. Once you see this, common sense stops being a reliable guide. It's not wisdom. It's just local consensus, and consensus can be wrong. Duh. Level 16. You are not the exception to bias. Most people have heard of cognitive biases, but they underestimate how pervasive they are. Confirmation bias doesn't just affect people you disagree with. It affects you right now as you read this. You're more likely to accept information that fits what you already believe and to scrutinize information that doesn't. This happens automatically, below conscious awareness. You can know about the bias and still fall into it. The solution isn't to try to eliminate bias. That's probably impossible. The solution is to assume you're biased and to build systems that compensate for it. Seek out disconfirming evidence. Steelman the positions you disagree with. Treat your own beliefs as hypotheses, not conclusions. Level 17. Regression. There's a concept in statistics called regression to the mean. It's simple but constantly misunderstood. If something is at an extreme, high or low, the next measurement is likely to be closer to average. Not because anything changed, but because extremes are rare and often involve luck. Here's where it gets interesting. People systematically misinterpret this. A student does poorly on a test, gets scolded, then does better. The parent thinks the scolding worked, but the improvement might just be regression to the mean. The student was having a bad day. A company has a great quarter, gets praised, then performs worse. People blame the leadership. But maybe it was just variance. We see patterns where there's only noise, and we build entire systems of reward and punishment on those illusions. Level 18. The survivor's story. Most people are familiar with the idea of survivorship bias from the story of bombers in World War II. Engineers wanted to reinforce the parts of returning planes that had the most bullet holes. A statistician pointed out that they should reinforce the parts with no bullet holes because planes hit there didn't return. The lesson generalizes. We study successful people, successful companies, successful strategies, and we try to learn from them. But we're only seeing the survivors. For every successful startup that dropped out of college, there are thousands that failed and disappeared. The patterns we think we see in success might just be noise. The real factors might be invisible because they're in the planes that didn't come back. Level 19. Social influence. Here's something uncomfortably true. Most people are far more influenced by social proof than they'd like to admit. If everyone around you believes something, you'll be inclined to believe it too, even if the evidence is weak. This is why cults work. This is why mass delusions spread. It's not that the people involved are stupid. It's that humans are deeply social animals, and our brains treat consensus as evidence. In environments where everyone agrees, dissent becomes cognitively difficult. It feels wrong, even when it's right. The only defense is to actively seek out people who think differently and to remember that a million people can be confidently, collectively wrong. Level 20. Why schools don't teach thinking. Most education systems teach you what to think, not how to think. You're given facts, dates, formulas, and you're tested on your ability to recall them. But recall is not understanding. Understanding is about seeing relationships, testing assumptions, generating new questions. It's about being able to take an idea apart and see why it works. Very few people are taught this explicitly. It's assumed you'll pick it up somehow, but most don't. The result is a population that can repeat information but can't evaluate it. They're vulnerable to anyone who sounds confident, anyone who uses the right jargon. Teaching people how to think is uncomfortable because it makes them harder to control. That might be why it's so rare. Level 21. The map is not the world. There's a concept called the map territory distinction, articulated by thinkers like Alfred Korzybski. The map is not the territory. The model is not the thing it represents. A map of a city is useful, but it's not the city. It's a simplified, selective representation. All models are like this. They're useful because they're simple, but they're wrong because they're simple. The danger comes when people forget this and treat the map as if it is the territory. Economic models, psychological diagnoses, political ideologies, they're all maps, useful but incomplete. The moment you believe the map is the territory, you stop seeing what the map leaves out, and what it leaves out might be the most important part. Level 22. Politics as identity defense. Most people think their political beliefs are based on reasoning, but research suggests the opposite is closer to the truth. People form political identities first, often based on social belonging or emotional intuition, and then they reason backwards to justify those identities. This is called motivated reasoning, and it's extraordinarily robust. Show someone evidence that contradicts their political beliefs, and they'll often become more entrenched, not less. The evidence doesn't update the belief. It triggers defensiveness. This isn't a left or right problem. It's a human problem. Your politics are not the result of rational deliberation. They're part of your identity, and identity is defended by the brain like territory. Once you see this, political arguments start to look less like debates and more like tribal signaling. Level 23. The illusion of the spotlight. Here's a strange fact. Most people wildly overestimate how much others are paying attention to them. Psychologists call this the spotlight effect. You think people notice your mistakes, your appearance, your awkwardness far more than they actually do. In reality, most people are too busy worrying about how they're being perceived to pay much attention to you. This has profound implications. Much of social anxiety is based on an illusion. The audience you think is watching and judging you mostly doesn't exist. Once you internalize this, a kind of freedom opens up. You're not on stage. No one's keeping score. You're far less visible than you think. And that's actually liberating. Level 24. The limits of expertise. Most people assume that expertise transfers across domains. A Nobel Prize-winning physicist is interviewed about politics, and people take their opinions seriously. A successful entrepreneur is asked about education policy, and people listen. But expertise is narrow. Being brilliant in one domain doesn't mean you're competent in another. In fact, high achievers sometimes fall into the trap of thinking their success gives them insight into everything. It doesn't. Thinkers since Socrates have recognized that wisdom begins with knowing the limits of your knowledge. The smartest people are often the ones who are very clear about where their expertise ends. The dangerous ones are those who aren't. Level 25. Morality before reason. Here's an uncomfortable observation. Most people's moral beliefs are not the result of careful reasoning. They're post hoc rationalizations of intuitions that arise instantly and automatically. You feel that something is wrong, and then you construct an argument for why it's wrong. Psychologists like Jonathan Haidt have studied this extensively. When people are asked why they believe something is immoral, they often struggle to articulate reasons, but the conviction remains. This doesn't mean morality is arbitrary. It means it's rooted in something deeper and older than reason. Your moral sense evolved to help you navigate social environments, not to be logically consistent. Once you see this, moral arguments start to look less like philosophy and more like emotional negotiation. Level 26. Intelligence is not one thing. Most people treat intelligence as a single measurable trait, but that's an oversimplification. There are people who are brilliant at abstract reasoning but can't navigate a social situation. There are people with extraordinary memory but poor judgment. There are people who excel at verbal tasks but struggle with spatial ones. Intelligence is not one thing. It's a cluster of capacities, and they don't always correlate. The obsession with IQ and standardized testing flattens this complexity. It privileges certain kinds of intelligence and ignores others. The result is that many people with profound cognitive gifts never get recognized because those gifts don't show up on the tests we've decided matter. The map, again, is not the territory. Level 27. Read carefully. Here's something that will change the way you read. Most books, even well-regarded ones, contain errors. Not just typos, but factual mistakes, misattributed quotes, oversimplified explanations. Authors are human. They misremember. They rely on secondary sources that were wrong. They make logical leaps that don't quite hold. And once something is in print, especially if it's repeated across multiple books, it starts to feel like fact. But the truth is, much of what you read is someone's best attempt, filtered through deadlines and editorial constraints and the limits of their knowledge. This doesn't mean you should stop reading. It means you should read with a light skepticism, always asking, how does the author know this? What might they be leaving out? Level 28. Decision. Neuroscience. Most people believe that their decisions are made consciously, but neuroscience has complicated this picture significantly. Studies using brain imaging have shown that unconscious brain activity can predict a decision seconds before the person reports being aware of making it. This raises a disquieting question. If the decision is made before you're conscious of it, in what sense did you make it? Philosophers have debated free will for millennia, but the neuroscience adds a new layer. It suggests that consciousness might be more like a narrator than an author. It tells the story of your actions, but it doesn't necessarily initiate them. You are not as in control as you feel, and the feeling of control might be part of the story your brain tells you after the fact. Level 29. How new truths are rejected. Here's a pattern you'll notice in history. Most revolutionary ideas were dismissed, ignored, or ridiculed before they were accepted. Germ theory, plate tectonics, the idea that washing hands could prevent disease. In each case, the evidence was available, but it didn't fit the existing framework, so it was rejected. The people proposing these ideas were often marginalized, not because they were wrong, but because they were threatening to established systems of belief and authority. This has an implication for the present. Some of the ideas that sound absurd today will be obvious tomorrow. The challenge is figuring out which ones. You can't do it by consensus. Consensus is what you're trying to escape. Level 30. Emotions as data. Most people treat emotions as obstacles to clear thinking, but that's a misunderstanding. Emotions are information. They're signals from systems in your brain that are tracking things your conscious mind isn't fully aware of. That vague sense of unease might be your brain detecting inconsistencies in someone's story. That sudden excitement might be pattern recognition signaling an opportunity. The problem isn't having emotions, it's not knowing how to interpret them. Emotions become obstacles when they're confused with reality. Feeling anxious doesn't mean danger's present. Feeling confident doesn't mean you're right. But dismissing emotions entirely is a mistake. They're data. You just have to learn to read them carefully and not let them make decisions on their own. Level 31. Knowledge lives in systems. Let's go deeper. Most people think of knowledge as something you have, but it's more accurate to think of it as something you participate in. You don't know things in isolation. You know them within systems of concepts, language, and social practices that make that knowledge possible. A surgeon doesn't just know how to operate. They know within a tradition of anatomy, medical training, technological infrastructure, and institutional support. Take away any piece of that system, and the knowledge becomes inaccessible. This is why knowledge can be lost. It's not just that books burn. It's that the living practices, the context that made the knowledge usable, can disappear. Knowledge is fragile in ways we rarely acknowledge. Level 32. The Availability Heuristic. There's a phenomenon researchers call the Availability Heuristic. People estimate the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind. If you can easily recall news stories about plane crashes, you'll overestimate how dangerous flying is. If you can think of several friends who got divorced, you'll think divorce is more common than it is. This heuristic is useful most of the time. Things you encounter frequently are more available in memory. But it's easily hijacked. Media coverage, personal experience, and vivid stories distort availability. The result is a systematic misperception of risk. People fear terrorism more than car accidents. They fear stranger abduction more than domestic abuse. The fears don't match the actual distribution of danger, and entire policies are built on these distortions. Level 33. The issue of categories. Here's something most people don't consider. The categories you use to organize the world are not natural. They're constructed, often for purposes that have nothing to do with truth. Take psychiatric diagnoses. The line between depression and sadness, between anxiety and worry, is not a fact of nature. It's a social and medical negotiation, revised with each edition of the diagnostic manual. This doesn't mean mental illness isn't real. It means the boundaries are fuzzy, and where we draw them has consequences. Some suffering gets medicalized, some gets ignored, some people get help, some get labeled. The categories shape not just how we treat people, but how people understand themselves, and those categories are always political, always contestable. Level 34. Progress is fragile. Most people assume that progress is linear and inevitable, that humanity is gradually getting better at everything. But history is full of regressions. The Library of Alexandria burned. The Roman aqueduct system fell into ruin. Technologies were lost and had to be rediscovered centuries later. Entire civilizations collapsed, and the knowledge they had accumulated disappeared. There's no law of nature that says progress continues. It requires active maintenance, institutions, education, infrastructure, and it can be undone faster than it was built. This isn't pessimism, it's realism. Progress is not a gift, it's a project, and it's always fragile. Level 35. Science inside a paradigm. Here's a troubling idea. Most people think science is objective, but science is done by humans, and humans bring all their biases, assumptions, and social pressures with them. Which questions get funded matters, which results get published matters, Peer review is supposed to filter out bad work, but it also enforces conformity. Radical ideas often get rejected not because they're wrong, but because they're too far outside the paradigm. Thomas Kuhn wrote about this. Science doesn't progress smoothly. It progresses in fits and starts, punctuated by revolutions where entire frameworks get overturned. In between, normal science operates within a paradigm, and that paradigm constrains what's thinkable. Science is the best tool we have for understanding reality, but it's not a neutral mirror. It's a human institution with all the flaws that entails. Level 36. Illusion of Monet. Most people have never really thought about what money is. It's not wealth, it's not value. It's a coordination mechanism, a shared fiction that allows strangers to cooperate. Money only works because everyone agrees to pretend it has value. The moment that agreement breaks, the money becomes worthless. This has happened repeatedly throughout history. Currencies collapse, inflation spirals, savings evaporate, and every time it's a reminder that the system is based on belief, not on anything solid. This doesn't mean money is fake in a dismissive sense. It means it's a social technology, and like all technologies, it can fail. The economy is not a natural system. It's a set of agreements, and agreements can be renegotiated or abandoned. Level 37. Collective action problem. Here's an insight from game theory. In many situations, the rational strategy for each individual leads to a worse outcome for everyone. This is called a collective action problem, and it's everywhere. Overfishing depletes the ocean, but each fisher is incentivized to catch as much as possible. Carbon emissions warm the planet, but each country benefits from cheap energy. No one wants to be the first to sacrifice, so everyone continues, and the commons collapses. The tragedy is that everyone involved can see the problem, can understand the logic, and still can't escape it. Solutions require coordination, enforcement, trust, things that are extremely hard to build and easy to break. Most global problems are not problems of ignorance, they're problems of coordination. Level 38. Different kinds of truth. Most people think of truth as binary. Something is either true or false, but in practice, truth is often contextual. A map is true if it helps you navigate. A scientific model is true if it makes accurate predictions. A story is true if it captures something essential about experience. These are different kinds of truth, and they don't always align. Newtonian. Physics is false in the strict sense, Einstein showed that. But it's true enough for building bridges. The question is not just, is it true, but true in what sense, for what purpose, at what scale? This is not relativism, it's precision. It's recognizing that truth is more textured than we usually allow. Level 39. The inherited mind. Here's a question that should unsettle you. How many of your beliefs did you choose? Most of them were inherited. You were born into a language, a culture, a religion, or lack of one, a political environment, a set of assumptions about how the world works. You didn't select these. They were given to you, and they shaped everything that came after. Even your rebellions against them are shaped by them. You can update beliefs, but you can't start from scratch. You're always working within a framework you didn't design. This doesn't mean you're not responsible for what you believe. It means that examining your beliefs requires stepping back and asking, why do I believe this? And am I confusing inheritance with insight? Level 40. Power without a face. Most people think of power as something certain people have. Politicians have power. CEOs have power. But power is better understood as a relationship, not a possession. You have power over someone if you can get them to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. That can be through force, through persuasion, through controlling resources, through shaping what seems normal or possible. Michel Foucault spent his career exploring this. Power is everywhere, embedded in language, in architecture, in everyday practices. It's often invisible precisely because it's so pervasive. Once you start seeing power as relational and diffuse, a lot of social dynamics that seem natural start to look constructed. And constructed things can be reconstructed. Level 41. Evidence never speaks alone. Here's a concept from the philosophy of science. Theories are underdetermined by evidence. This means that for any set of observations, there are multiple theories that could explain them. You can't derive the theory directly from the data. You have to make choices guided by simplicity, elegance, consistency with other theories, and sometimes just intuition. Scientists don't like to emphasize this because it sounds like theories are arbitrary, but they're not arbitrary. They're constrained by evidence, just not uniquely determined by it. This is why scientific revolutions are possible. The same data can be organized into a completely different framework, and sometimes the new framework works better. Evidence doesn't force conclusions, it limits them, but interpretation always remains. Level 42. Limits of thoughts. Most people assume that language is a tool for conveying thoughts that exist prior to language. But some thinkers, from Wittgenstein to Sapir-Whorf, have suggested the opposite. Thought might depend on language. You can't think what you can't say. This is why translation is so difficult. Some concepts don't map across languages. Some distinctions exist in one language and not another. And if thought depends on language, then the limits of your language are, in a real sense, the limits of your world. Learning a new language doesn't just give you new words. It gives you new ways of organizing experience, new things to notice. It expands the space of possible thoughts. Level 43. The paradox of institutions. Here's a practical observation. Most institutions, once established, prioritize their own survival over their original purpose. A nonprofit created to solve a problem has an incentive to perpetuate the problem, because solving it would eliminate the need for the organization. A regulatory body becomes captured by the industry it's supposed to regulate. A political party cares more about winning elections than about governance. This isn't always conscious or malicious, it's structural. Institutions are made of people, and those people need salaries, status, purpose. The mission becomes secondary to the maintenance of the institution itself. This is why reform from within is so difficult. The structure resists change because change threatens its existence. Level 44. Choice paralysis. Most people think that if they just had more information, they'd make better decisions. But past a certain point, more information makes decisions harder, not easier. Psychologists call this information overload or choice paralysis. When you have too many options, too much data, the cognitive load becomes overwhelming. You start second-guessing yourself. You freeze, or you fall back on heuristics and ignore most of the information anyway. The skill is not gathering more information, it's knowing what information matters and what to ignore. This is wisdom. It's the ability to simplify complexity without losing what's essential. More is not always better. Sometimes it's just more. Level 45. Are people good? Here's a disturbing idea from social psychology. In the right circumstances, ordinary people will do monstrous things. The Milgram experiments, the Stanford prison experiment. These studies, controversial as they are, suggested that cruelty doesn't require evil people. It requires the right conditions, authority, roles, distance from consequences, incremental steps. Most people like to think they'd be the exception, that they'd resist, but the data suggests otherwise. This doesn't excuse anything. It means that focusing only on individual morality misses the point. Systems and structures shape behavior in powerful ways. If you want to prevent atrocities, you don't just educate individuals, you change the conditions that make atrocities possible. Level 46. Knowing bias doesn't stop bias. Most people trust their perception far more than they should. Optical illusions are the clearest example. You know the lines are the same length. You've measured them, but you still see one as longer. Perception is not corrected by knowledge. It's built at a level below conscious access. The same is true for cognitive illusions. You can know about the sunk cost fallacy and still throw good money after bad because it feels wrong to walk away. You can know about groupthink and still go along with the consensus. Knowing about a bias doesn't make you immune to it. The architecture of your mind operates below the level of conscious control, And it doesn't update just because you've read about it. You have to actively intervene, build external systems, check yourself constantly. Level 47. Here's something deeply strange about probability. Most people's intuitions about it are systematically wrong. If you flip a fair coin and it comes up heads 5 times in a row, what's the probability of heads on the next flip? Still 50%. The coin has no memory. But most people feel like tails is due, like the universe owes them balance. This is called the gambler's fallacy, and it's remarkably persistent. Probability is not intuitive. Our minds evolved in environments where events were often causally linked, where patterns were real. But randomness doesn't have patterns, and our pattern-detecting brains see them anyway. This leads to superstition, to seeing meaning in noise, to making bad bets. Understanding probability requires overriding intuition, again and again. Level 48. The mind versus probability. Most people think scientific consensus is evidence that something is true, and usually it is. But consensus is also a social phenomenon. Scientists are influenced by funding, by career incentives, by the desire to be respected by peers. Paradigms become entrenched not just because they were correct, but because they are institutionalized. Textbooks are written, careers are built, dissent becomes professionally costly. Occasionally, someone challenges the consensus and turns out to be right, but they pay a price for it. This doesn't mean you should distrust all scientific consensus. It means you should understand that consensus is not the same as truth. It's a signal, often a reliable one, but it's not infallible. Stay curious, stay skeptical. Level 49. Virtue ethics. Here's a shift in perspective. Most people think about ethics in terms of rules. Don't lie, don't steal. But there's another tradition, virtue ethics, that focuses on character. The question is not what should I do in this situation, but what kind of person should I be? This shifts the entire frame. Instead of asking whether a specific act is permissible, you ask whether it's the kind of thing a good person would do. Instead of optimizing decisions, you cultivate habits. Aristotle wrote about this extensively. Virtue is not knowledge, it's practice. You become brave by doing brave things, generous by doing generous things. Morality is not a calculation, it's a way of being, and it's built over time through repeated action. Level 50. History without heroes. Most people assume that history is driven by great individuals, kings, generals, inventors. But there's another view, that history is shaped by material conditions, by technology, by economics, by geography. The individual leaders are just playing out roles that the conditions made possible. Would the Industrial Revolution have happened without specific inventors? Probably. The conditions were ripe. Someone would have figured it out. Would World War I have happened without the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand? Probably. The tensions were already there. The individual was just the spark. This isn't to say individuals don't matter. It's to say that focusing only on individuals blinds you to the deeper currents. History is not a story of heroes and villains. It's a collision of forces, and the individuals are carried along, even when they think they're steering. Level 51. Arguments are about values. Here's a thought that will rearrange how you see arguments. Most disagreements are not about facts. They're about values, definitions, or frameworks. Two people can look at the same data and reach opposite conclusions because they are asking different questions or prioritizing different values. One person says a policy increases freedom. Another says it increases inequality. They're both right within their frame. The disagreement is about which matters more. Recognizing this doesn't resolve the disagreement, but it changes the nature of it. You're no longer debating facts, you're negotiating values. That's harder because values are personal and foundational, but it's more honest. And sometimes, understanding that you're actually disagreeing about values makes the conversation more productive because you stop talking past each other. Level 52. Technologies carry politics. Most people think technology is neutral, just a tool that can be used for good or ill. But technologies have politics built into them. A city designed around cars is different from a city designed around public transit. The car city spreads out, isolates people, makes walkability difficult. The transit city is denser, more social, more accessible to people without cars. The technology shapes the society. Nuclear power requires centralized control and security, which has political implications. Renewable energy can be more distributed, which has different implications. The choices we make about technology are also choices about what kind of society we want. And often, those choices are made without public deliberation by engineers and corporations, and we inherit the consequences. Level 53. Fixes that break the system. Here's a concept from systems thinking. Most problems have unintended consequences, and often the solution to one problem creates another problem elsewhere. You dam a river to generate power, and downstream ecosystems collapse. You introduce a predator to control a pest, and it hunts native species to extinction. You prescribe antibiotics too freely, and you breed resistant bacteria. The world is not a machine where you can fix one part in isolation. It's a web, and pulling on one thread moves the whole structure. Effective intervention requires thinking in loops and feedback, anticipating second-order and third-order effects. Most policy failures are failures of systems thinking. The intervention worked locally but failed globally, or worked in the short term but failed in the long term. Level 54. Reason needs feeling. Most people treat emotions and reason as opposites, but that's a false dichotomy. Reason without emotion is paralysis. People with damage to the emotional centers of their brain have been studied extensively. They can reason abstractly, but they struggle with decisions, especially practical ones. They get stuck weighing options endlessly because nothing feels more important than anything else. Emotion provides the valence, the sense that this matters more than that. Reason provides structure and evaluation. You need both. The goal is not to eliminate emotion, it's to integrate it with reason, to feel clearly and think carefully, and to know which mode is appropriate when. Level 55. Replaceable but responsible. Here's an uncomfortable truth. Most people are far more replaceable than they believe. In almost any role, someone else could step in and the system would continue. This sounds harsh, but it's not meant to diminish anyone. It's an observation about systems. Organizations, societies, ecosystems, they're structured to survive the loss of individuals. That's resilience. But it also means that individual significance is not inherent. It's constructed through relationships, through the unique ways you affect others, through the specific differences you make. The meaning of your life is not given. It's something you create through choice and action, and that's actually more empowering than the illusion that you're irreplaceable. It puts the responsibility where it belongs, on you. Level 56. When intuition beats analysis, most people assume that expertise is always better than intuition, but in some domains, intuition is actually superior. When a situation is complex, fast-moving, and information-rich, deliberate analysis is too slow. Experienced firefighters, chess grandmasters, emergency room doctors, they don't consciously reason through every decision. They recognize patterns instantly, often without being able to articulate why. This is intuition, and it's the result of thousands of hours of experience compressing into rapid perception. Gary Klein studied this extensively. Intuition is not mystical. It's pattern recognition honed through practice, but it only works in domains where you've had enough feedback to calibrate. In unfamiliar territory, intuition is just guessing. Level 57. The importance of diversity. Here's a principle from ecology that applies far beyond biology. Diversity increases resilience. An ecosystem with many species can absorb shocks better than a monoculture. If one species fails, others fill the niche. The same is true for economies, for organizations, for intellectual traditions. A society with diverse perspectives, diverse skills, diverse strategies is more adaptable. Monocultures are efficient in stable environments, but they're fragile. When conditions change, they collapse. This is why ideological conformity is dangerous. It makes a society brittle. Disagreement is not dysfunction, it's insurance. It's the redundancy that allows survival when the environment shifts. Level 58. The mind beyond the skull. Most people think of the self as something internal, a private consciousness, but much of what you are is external. Your memories are partly stored in photo albums, in journals, in conversations with old friends. Your cognition is distributed across notebooks, calendars, smartphones. Your identity is partly constituted by your roles, your relationships, your reputation. Philosophers call this the extended mind. If you lose your phone, you lose part of your cognitive capacity. If you lose your community, you lose part of your identity. The boundary between self and world is not as clear as it feels. You are not contained in your skull. You're spread out, entangled with tools and people and environments. Recognizing this changes how you think about autonomy, about individuality, about what it means to be a person. Level 59. Invisible suffering. Here's a dark thought. Most of the suffering in the world is invisible. It's not dramatic. It's quiet, persistent, grinding. People in chronic pain, people in bad jobs they can't leave, people caring for sick relatives, people trapped in poverty. The visibility of suffering is not proportional to its magnitude. What gets attention is what's unusual, sudden, or photogenic. This distorts moral priorities. Resources flow to visible suffering, and invisible suffering is neglected. Media amplifies this. Disasters get coverage. Slow crises don't. The implication is that if you want to do good, you have to actively resist the pull of attention. You have to seek out the suffering that's not on the front page, not in the viral video. That's where help is often needed most. Level 60. Why you can't spot a liar. Most people assume that they're good at detecting lies, but research consistently shows otherwise. Humans perform barely above chance in lie detection tasks, even trained professionals. The problem is that the cues we think indicate lying, like avoiding eye contact or fidgeting, are actually just signs of nervousness, which can happen for many reasons. Some liars are nervous, some truth-tellers are nervous, and skilled liars can control these cues. The confidence you feel when you think someone is lying is not evidence, it's just confidence. The same applies to detecting sincerity. Competence, trustworthiness from appearance or manner. Your intuition is not reliable here. It's pattern matching based on stereotypes and limited experience. Treat it as a hypothesis, not a conclusion. Level 61. Coherence versus reality. Let's go deeper still. There's a tension at the heart of knowledge between coherence and correspondence. Coherence means your beliefs fit together logically, they're consistent, they support each other. Correspondence means your beliefs match reality. Ideally, you want both, but sometimes you have to choose. A paranoid delusion can be internally coherent. Every piece of evidence is explained, but it doesn't correspond to reality. On the other hand, reality is often messy and contradictory, and insisting on perfect coherence can lead you to reject true but inconvenient facts. Most people don't navigate this tension consciously. They privilege one or the other by instinct. But wisdom requires holding both, knowing when coherence matters and when you need to let a contradiction stand, because that's what the evidence demands. Level 62. Identity over time is negotiated. Here's a philosophical puzzle. Most people assume that objects persist through time. The table you see now is the same table you saw yesterday. But what does same mean? Every atom in your body is replaced over the course of years. Are you the same person? The table gets scratched, repaired, pieces replaced. Is it the same table? This is the ship of Theseus problem, and it doesn't have a clean answer. Identity over time is not a fact, it's a convention. We treat things as persisting because it's useful, because our concepts require it. But the continuity is something we impose, not something we discover. This applies to nations, to corporations, to traditions. They change continuously, and at some point the question becomes, is this still the same thing, or something new pretending to be old? Level 63. The problem with causes. Most people think they understand causation, but it's philosophically treacherous. You say the rock broke the window. But what does that mean? The rock's impact caused a change in the glass's molecular structure, but the rock's trajectory was caused by your throwing it. And your decision to throw it was caused by anger, which was caused by an insult, which was caused by a misunderstanding. Where does causation start? Where does it end? David Hume argued that we never perceive causation directly. We see one event followed by another, and we infer a connection. But the connection itself is invisible. It's a habit of thought, not an observed fact. Causation might be something we impose on the world to make it predictable, not something that exists independently. And if that's true, a lot of confident causal claims become suspect. Level 64. Freedom as a practical concept. Here's a challenge to determinism and free will. Most people assume one or the other is true. Either your actions are determined by prior causes or you have free will. But maybe both are wrong. Maybe the question is confused. Compatibilists argue that free will is compatible with determinism. You're free if you act according to your desires, even if those desires were caused. Incompatibilists say that's not real freedom. The debate has raged for centuries. But perhaps freedom is not a metaphysical fact. It's a practical concept. You're free when you're not coerced, when you have options, when your actions express your values. That kind of freedom is real and meaningful, even if the universe is deterministic. The metaphysical debate might be irrelevant to how you should live. Level 65. Logic has edges. Most people treat logic as if it's the foundation of rationality. But logic is a formal system, and formal systems have limits. Gödel's incompleteness theorems proved that any sufficiently powerful logical system either contains statements that can't be proved within the system or is inconsistent. This means you can't have a complete and consistent foundation for all of mathematics, let alone for all of knowledge. There will always be truths that escape the system. This doesn't make logic useless. It makes it limited. It means that rationality can't be reduced to computation. There's always something outside the frame, something that can't be captured by rules. Wisdom is knowing when to apply logic and when to step outside it. Level 66. Living without absolute certainty. Here's a disturbing idea from epistemology. You can't prove that the external world exists. Maybe you're a brain in a vat being fed sensory experiences by a computer. Maybe you're dreaming, and everything you perceive is a hallucination. René Descartes explored this. He concluded that the only thing he could be certain of was his own thinking. I think, therefore I am. But he couldn't prove anything beyond that without appealing to God, which is not a universally convincing move. Modern philosophers have mostly given up on absolute certainty. Instead, they argue for provisional trust. The external world probably exists because that's the simplest explanation for your experiences. But probably is not certainly. You live with ineliminable doubt at the foundation. That's not a bug. That's the human condition. Level 67. When science only needs to work. Most people think science aims at truth, but some philosophers of science argue it aims at something weaker, empirical adequacy. A theory is empirically adequate if it correctly predicts observations, even if the entities it posits don't actually exist. Atoms, quarks, dark matter, these might just be useful fictions, tools for generating predictions. Bas van Fraassen called this position constructive empiricism. You don't have to believe the theory is true, only that it works. This sounds like a retreat, but it's actually more defensively robust. It avoids betting on the unobservable. History is full of discarded scientific entities like phlogiston or the luminiferous ether. Maybe today's entities will be discarded too. What persists is not the entities, but the empirical patterns. Focus on what you can observe and be agnostic about the rest. Level 68. Meaning is collective. Here's an insight from philosophy of language. Meaning is not in your head. It's not private. Wittgenstein argued that a private language is impossible. Meaning comes from use within a community. The word pain doesn't refer to a private sensation that only you have access to. It's part of a public language game. You learn to use it by observing how others use it, and your use is correct insofar as it aligns with that community practice. This has radical implications. Your thoughts, insofar as they're linguistic, are not purely private. They're shaped by shared practices. You don't own your meanings. They're collective. This undermines the idea of the isolated individual mind and suggests that thinking is always already social. Level 69. Natural does not mean good. Most people assume that if something is natural, it's good. But this is a fallacy. Nature is full of disease, suffering, predation, death. Natural doesn't mean optimal or moral. It just means it occurs without human intervention. The naturalistic fallacy confuses description with prescription, confuses is with ought. Many terrible things are natural. Many wonderful things are artificial. Medicine is artificial. Kindness to strangers is arguably unnatural. We evolved to favor kin and tribe. Rejecting something just because it's artificial, or embracing something just because it's natural, is lazy thinking. The question is not whether something is natural. The question is whether it's good, and that requires argument, evidence, reflection, not an appeal to nature. Level 70 House. Responsibility without control. Here's a hard question. Can you be held responsible for things you don't consciously control? Your implicit biases, your emotional reactions, your automatic judgments, you didn't choose them. They're the product of evolution, culture, personal history. But they're yours in the sense that they arise from your brain and they affect your behavior. Some philosophers argue that responsibility requires control, and you can't be responsible for things outside your control. Others argue that responsibility is about your dispositions, your character, and those include unconscious elements. There's no consensus, but the question matters. If you're not responsible for unconscious bias, then bias training is pointless. If you are responsible, then you have an obligation to examine and change parts of yourself you never chose. Neither answer is comfortable. Level 71. Flaws of induction. Most people think induction is obviously valid. You observe the sun rising every day, so you conclude it will rise tomorrow. But David Hume pointed out that this reasoning is circular. You're assuming the future will resemble the past, but the only justification for that assumption is that the future has resembled the past in the past, which is circular. There's no logical foundation for induction. It's a habit. It works until it doesn't. This is called the problem of induction, and it's never been solved. Science depends on induction, and induction depends on an unprovable assumption. This doesn't mean you should stop using induction. It means you should be humble about it. Every prediction is a bet, and the universe doesn't owe you consistency. Level 72. When morality collides with culture. Here's a thought that destabilizes ethics. Most moral theories assume that some actions are objectively right or wrong, but moral relativists argue that morality is culturally constructed. What's right in one society is wrong in another, and there's no neutral standpoint from which to judge. Female genital cutting is wrong in liberal societies and obligatory in some traditional ones. Who's correct? The liberal says their values are universal. The relativist says that's just cultural imperialism. This is not easy to resolve. The liberal risks imposing their values. The relativist risks condoning atrocity. One way forward is pluralism. Multiple moral frameworks can coexist, and sometimes there's genuine moral disagreement that can't be fully resolved. That's uncomfortable, but it might be the truth. Level 73. The self as a story. Most people think personal identity is obvious. You're you because you have continuity of memory, body, and psychology. But each of these criteria has problems. Memory is unreliable and malleable. Your body changes entirely over time. Your psychology shifts with age, experience, brain chemistry. Derek Parfit explored this with thought experiments. If your brain is split and each hemisphere is transplanted into a new body, are both of the resulting people you? Is neither. Is one. There's no clear answer. Personal identity might not be a fact. It might be a useful fiction, something we construct to navigate social and legal reality. The self is not a solid thing. It's a story, continuously revised, and the story is all there is. Level 74. The queerness of moral facts. Here's a challenge to moral realism. If moral facts exist independently of humans, how do we access them? We can see physical objects and measure physical forces, but moral facts, if they exist, are not physical. They don't emit light or exert force. So how do we know them? J.L. Mackie called this the queerness problem. Moral facts would have to be metaphysically strange, and our access to them would have to be stranger still. It's far simpler to say that morality is a human construction, evolved and refined to facilitate cooperation. This doesn't make morality arbitrary. It's constrained by human psychology, by the conditions of social life. But it does mean morality is not discovered, it's created. And what's created can be changed. Level 75. Who deserves moral standing? Most people assume that consciousness is what makes something morally considerable. You shouldn't harm conscious beings because they can suffer. But what counts as conscious? Animals, clearly. But insects? Plants respond to their environment. Are they conscious? What about AI systems? If a system behaves as if it's in pain, reports pain, seeks to avoid pain, does it matter whether there's something it's like to be that system? Philosophers like Daniel Dennett have questioned whether consciousness is even the right criterion. Maybe what matters is the capacity for preferences, for caring about outcomes. Maybe consciousness is overrated, a red herring. The ethical landscape might be far more populated than we think, or far less. We don't know. Level 76. The burden of radical freedom. Here's an insight from existentialism. Most people live in bad faith, denying their freedom and responsibility by pretending they're determined by circumstances, by roles, by social expectations. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that existence precedes essence. You're not born with a fixed nature. You create yourself through your choices. But this freedom is terrifying, so people hide from it. They say, I had no choice when they did. They conform to roles and call it duty. Authenticity means owning your freedom, accepting that you're responsible for who you are. This is not comfortable. It's a burden, but it's also liberation. You're not trapped. You're free, radically free, and the life you're living is the result of choices you've made and continue to make. Level 77. Meaning is made, not found. Most people think meaning is something you find. You find your purpose, you find your calling. But existentialists argue that meaning is something you create. The universe is indifferent. There's no cosmic plan. You're born, you live, you die, and none of it means anything unless you make it mean something. This could be nihilistic, but it doesn't have to be. If meaning is created, then you have the power to create it. You decide what matters. You commit to projects, to relationships, to values, and through that commitment, your life becomes meaningful. Meaning is not a discovery. It's an act of will, sustained over time, and it's fragile. You have to keep choosing it. Level 78. Attachment is the root of suffering. Here's a principle from Buddhist philosophy. Most suffering comes from attachment and aversion. You want things to be different than they are. You cling to pleasure. You resist pain. This constant striving creates suffering. The solution is not to stop caring, but to cultivate equanimity, a kind of engaged detachment. You participate fully in life, but you don't cling to outcomes. You do your best and let go. This sounds passive, but it's not. It's a form of wisdom. It acknowledges that much of life is beyond your control, and that acceptance is not defeat. It's clarity. You can't control what happens, but you can control how you respond. And the quality of your life depends far more on the latter than the former. Level 79. Why happiness never arrives. Most people think of happiness as a state you achieve, a destination. But research in psychology suggests it's more like a treadmill. You achieve a goal, you feel good briefly, then you adapt and return to baseline. This is called hedonic adaptation. You get the job, the partner, the house, and each time the satisfaction fades. This could be depressing, but it has an implication. If happiness is not in the achievement, it must be in the process, in the striving, in the relationships, in the meaning you find along the way. Focusing on outcomes is a trap. You'll never arrive. The practice is to engage with the process fully, to find satisfaction in the doing, not just in the having. That's sustainable. Level 80. When outcomes aren't enough, here's a challenge to utilitarian ethics. Utilitarianism says you should maximize happiness or well-being for the greatest number. Sounds reasonable, but it leads to uncomfortable conclusions. If torturing one innocent person would prevent greater suffering for many, is it the right thing to do? Most people recoil from this, but the utilitarian logic seems to require it. This is the trolley problem generalized. Utilitarian calculus often conflicts with intuitions about rights, about justice, about the separateness of persons. Maybe consequences are not all that matter. Maybe some actions are wrong regardless of outcomes. Or maybe our intuitions are wrong, distorted by evolutionary history that didn't prepare us for modern moral dilemmas. There's no easy answer. Ethics is hard, and anyone who says otherwise is selling something. Level 81. When justification fails, most people assume knowledge requires certainty, or at least justification. But Edmund Gettier showed that justified true belief is not sufficient for knowledge. You can have a belief that's true and justified, but true for the wrong reasons, and that doesn't seem like knowledge. This sparked decades of debate in epistemology. What is knowledge? How do you know that you know? Some philosophers gave up on defining it. Others proposed increasingly complex criteria. But maybe knowledge is not a natural kind. Maybe it's a cluster concept or a contextual judgment. What counts as knowledge in one situation might not in another. The question, do you know, is always relative to standards, and standards shift. Absolute knowledge might be an illusion. All we have is confidence, calibrated to context. Level 82. The limits of moral math. Here's a thought experiment from ethics. You're a doctor. 5 patients need organ transplants or they'll die. A healthy patient comes in for a checkup. If you killed that patient and distributed their organs, you'd save 5 lives. Should you do it? Almost everyone says no, it's murder. But why? If outcomes are what matter, 5 lives outweigh 1. The reason most people reject this is because it violates something deeper: respect for persons, rights, the prohibition against using people as mere means. Immanuel Kant formalized this. People are ends in themselves, not tools. This principle conflicts with utilitarian reasoning, and there's no higher principle that resolves the conflict. You have to choose which framework you're operating in, and the choice reveals your moral commitments. Level 83. Science is value-laden. Most people think science is value-neutral, just describing the world as it is, but science is saturated with values from the start. Which questions get asked? Which variables get measured? What counts as a significant result? Feminist philosophers of science have pointed out that research priorities have historically reflected the interests of powerful groups, mostly men, mostly Western. Medical research used male subjects and assumed the results generalized to women. They often didn't. Ecological studies focused on competition and ignored cooperation. The framework shaped what could be seen. Science is not a view from nowhere. It's a view from somewhere, and that somewhere is shaped by culture, power, and values. This doesn't discredit science. It means you have to ask whose questions are being answered and whose are being ignored. Level 84. The cost of truth. Here's a paradox. Most people want their beliefs to be true, but truth can be costly. Knowing certain things might make you less happy, less motivated, more cynical. If a comforting belief is false but beneficial, should you believe it? This is the question of noble lies. Plato thought rulers should sometimes lie to citizens for the good of the state. Nietzsche thought truth was overrated, that life-affirming illusions might be more valuable. Most people recoil from this. Truth is sacred. But is it? Or is truth one value among many, to be weighed against well-being, against meaning, against social cohesion? There's no consensus. But the tension is real. Sometimes the truth hurts, sometimes ignorance is bliss, and you have to decide which you value more. Level 85. Rationality serves values. Most people assume that rationality is good, that you should be rational, but rationality is instrumental. It's about achieving your goals, whatever they are. If your goals are terrible, rationality just makes you more effectively terrible. Rationality is not a value, it's a tool. This is why appeals to rationality are not always persuasive. You can be perfectly rational in service of irrational ends. The real question is not whether you're rational, but what you're being rational for. What do you value? Why? Those questions are not answered by rationality. They're prior to it. Rationality takes you from values to actions, but it doesn't tell you what to value. That requires something else: reflection, empathy, wisdom, things that might not be purely rational. Level 86. Growing up is accepting complexity. Let's enter the final stretch. Here's a meta-level observation. Most of what you've learned today challenges something, but challenge is not refutation. Pointing out a problem with a belief doesn't prove it's false. It shows the belief is more complicated than it appeared. This is the space where intellectual growth happens, in the recognition that things are harder than you thought. Simple answers are comforting, but the world resists simplification. Maturity is the ability to live with complexity, with ambiguity, with unresolved questions. You don't have to have answers to everything. In fact, pretending you do is often a sign of immaturity. Wisdom is knowing what you don't know and being comfortable with that. Level 87. The case against a single worldview. Most people want coherence, a unified worldview where everything fits together. But maybe coherence is overrated. Maybe the world is irreducibly plural, full of tensions that can't be resolved. Different domains of life require different frameworks. Science, art, ethics, spirituality, they each have their own logic. Trying to force them into one system does violence to the phenomena. Isaiah Berlin called this value pluralism. Different values, liberty, equality, security, community, they conflict, and there's no master value that resolves the conflicts. You have to make trade-offs, and the trade-offs are tragic. There's no optimal solution. Life is not an optimization problem. It's a balancing act, and sometimes you drop things. That's not failure. That's the human condition. Level 88. Doing good beyond intuition. Here's an ethical implication. Most people focus on their immediate circle, family, friends, community. But moral consideration doesn't stop at proximity. People far away, people in the future, people unlike you, they matter too. Peter Singer has argued for effective altruism, using reason to figure out how to do the most good. This often means directing resources away from emotionally salient causes toward less visible but more effective interventions. It's uncomfortable because it conflicts with intuition. You want to help people you can see, people you feel connected to. But feeling is not a reliable guide to impact. This doesn't mean you should ignore feeling entirely, but it means you should also step back and ask, where can I do the most good? The answer might surprise you. Wutant? Level 89. Knowing makes you accountable. Most people assume that more knowledge is always better, but knowledge brings responsibility. Once you know, you can't unknow. Once you see a problem, you're implicated. Ignorance provides a kind of moral insulation. You're not responsible for what you don't know. But as you learn more, that insulation dissolves. You become accountable. This is the cost of the journey you've taken here. You've been shown things. You can't pretend you haven't seen them. The question now is what you do with it. Do you act on what you know? Do you share it? Do you let it change you? Knowledge without action is sterile, but action without reflection is reckless. The balance is difficult, and it's personal. No one can tell you how to carry what you now know. Level 90. Living with an uncertain future. Here's a thought about the future. Most people assume that progress will continue, that things will get better, but there's no guarantee. The future is radically uncertain. Climate change, technological disruption, geopolitical instability, pandemics. We're navigating risks that previous generations didn't face. And the risks are interconnected. A crisis in one domain cascades into others. The systems we depend on are fragile. This isn't doomism. It's realism. The future depends on choices we make now, collectively. And those choices are made in the context of limited knowledge, conflicting interests, and deep uncertainty. The most important thing you can do is stay engaged, stay informed, and act with humility. You don't know how things will turn out. No one does. But abdicating responsibility is not an option. Level Ahinadrano. Technology as amplifier. Most people think technology will solve our problems, but technology is not neutral. It amplifies what already exists, both good and bad. Social media amplifies connection and loneliness. AI amplifies productivity and surveillance. Biotechnology amplifies healing and inequality. The question is not whether to adopt new technologies, but how to shape them, how to govern them, how to ensure they serve human flourishing and not just profit or power. This requires public deliberation, ethical reflection, and political will. But most technological change happens faster than democratic processes can respond. By the time we've debated the ethics, the technology is already embedded. The challenge of the 21st century is learning to steer technological change rather than being swept along by it. Level 92. Knowledge has no final level. Here's a reflection on knowledge itself. You've moved through 100 levels, but levels are an illusion. Knowledge is not hierarchical in this way. It's networked, rhizomatic, spreading in all directions. There's no single path, no ultimate level where everything is resolved. Each thing you learn opens up new questions, new uncertainties. This is not frustrating. It's what makes learning worthwhile. If knowledge were finite, you'd eventually run out. But it's not. It's inexhaustible. Every answer is a doorway. This means the journey you've been on here never really ends. You don't graduate from curiosity, you deepen into it, and the deepening is the point. Level 93. Uncertainty as strength. Most people want certainty, but certainty is the enemy of learning. If you're certain, you stop questioning, you stop updating, you become brittle. Uncertainty, by contrast, is generative. It keeps you open, keeps you searching. The most intellectually alive people are those who are comfortable not knowing, who can hold questions without rushing to answers. This is not indecisiveness, it's epistemic humility. It's the recognition that reality is larger and stranger than any framework you could build. You can have strong beliefs, you can act decisively, but you should hold it all lightly, ready to revise when new evidence comes. Confidence without certainty. That's the balance. Level 94. Why depth resists summary. Here's a thought about communication. Most of what you've encountered here resists easy summary. You can't reduce it to slogans or bullet points. Depth takes time. It takes patience. It requires sustained attention, which is increasingly rare. The pressures of modern media push toward simplification, toward hot takes and sound bites. But some truths can't be simplified without being distorted. They have to be approached carefully, turned over, examined from multiple angles. This is why long-form thinking matters. It's not about being exhaustive. It's about giving ideas the space they need to breathe. If you've stayed with this all the way through, you've practiced something valuable, the ability to sit with complexity. That's rare. Hold on to it. Level 95. Education as transformation. Most people think education is about transferring information from teacher to student. But real education is transformation. It's not about filling your head with facts. It's about changing how you see, how you think, how you engage with the world. Socrates understood this. He didn't lecture. He asked questions, destabilizing his students' assumptions, forcing them to think for themselves. That's what this has been. An attempt not to give you answers, but to complicate your questions. If you're leaving here more uncertain than when you arrived, that's success. Certainty is static. Uncertainty is dynamic, and it's in the dynamic space that growth happens. Level 96. Intellectual charity. Here's an ethical reflection. Most people are doing their best with the knowledge and resources they have. This includes people you disagree with, people you find frustrating, people whose beliefs you think are harmful. They're not monsters. They're humans, embedded in contexts that shape their thinking, responding to incentives and pressures you might not see. This doesn't mean all beliefs are equal. Some are better than others, more informed, more reflective, more aligned with evidence. But dismissing people as stupid or evil is intellectually lazy. It stops the conversation. Charity, the principle of interpreting others generously, is not just moral. It's epistemically useful. It forces you to understand positions before you reject them, and sometimes, understanding changes your mind. Level 97. Influence through trust. Most people think influence is about argument, about marshaling evidence and logic to convince someone. But people are not convinced by arguments. They're convinced by trust, by stories, by identification. You're far more likely to change someone's mind if they see you as an ally than if they see you as an opponent. This means the mode matters as much as the content. Calm beats outrage. Curiosity beats condemnation. Listening beats lecturing. If you want to share what you've learned, don't start with the conclusion. Start with the question. Invite people into the process. Let them discover things for themselves. That's how minds actually change, slowly, organically, through connection and trust. Level 98. Structure is a scaffold. Here's a reflection on structure. The levels you've moved through were a scaffold, a way to organize ideas. But the structure was arbitrary. The ideas could have been arranged differently. There's no natural order. This is true of all knowledge. The way we categorize, the way we sequence, it's a choice, made for pedagogical or rhetorical reasons. But people often mistake the structure for the content. They think knowledge comes in neat packages, fields, and disciplines, chapters and sections. It doesn't. Reality is continuous. The divisions are ours. When you step away from this, remember that the ideas don't live in levels. They live in networks, connected in ways that no linear presentation can fully capture. The structure got you here, but now you have to let it go. Level 99. Why there is no conclusion. Most people at this point want a conclusion, a synthesis, a takeaway. But that's not what you're going to get. Conclusions are closures, and closure is premature. You've been exposed to a lot, maybe too much to integrate all at once. That's fine. Let it sit. Let it percolate. Some of it will stick. Some will fade. Some will return later, suddenly relevant in a context you can't predict now. The goal was never to give you a complete system. It was to open doors, to show you that there's more than you thought, that the familiar is strange, that the settled is contested. What you do with that is up to you. There's no script. There's just the ongoing practice of thinking, questioning, revising, and that practice is lifelong. Level $100. Wakefulness as a choice. Here's the final thought. Knowledge is not power. Knowledge is responsibility. The more you know, the less you can pretend. The less you can rely on simple stories, easy answers, comfortable ignorance. You've taken on a burden here. But it's a burden worth carrying. Because the alternative, living in illusion, living in someone else's story, is a kind of abdication. You're more awake now than you were. Not all the way awake, no one is, but more. And with that wakefulness comes a choice. You can retreat. You can decide it's too much, too uncomfortable, and go back to sleep. Or you can lean in. You can keep questioning, keep learning, Keep engaging with the world as it actually is, not as you wish it were. That's harder. But it's also more alive, and in the end, being alive, really alive, might be the only thing that matters. There's no grand conclusion to offer here, no triumphant synthesis. You've moved through 100 fragments of thought, each one gesturing towards something larger. Some contradicted each other. That's intentional. The world doesn't resolve into a single story. It's plural, messy, unfinished. And so are you. What you've encountered here is not forbidden in the dramatic sense. No one will punish you for knowing it. But it is, in a quieter way, knowledge that resists easy incorporation. It asks you to see differently, to hold things lightly, to accept that much of what you were taught was incomplete or contingent or shaped by forces you didn't choose. The work now is not to memorize what you've heard, it's to practice. Practice skepticism without cynicism. Practice openness without credulity. Practice conviction without rigidity. These are not easy balances. They take time, they take failure, but they're worth cultivating. If you're feeling unsettled, that's appropriate. Certainty is comfortable, but it's a cage. Uncertainty is uncomfortable, but it's a horizon. You're standing at that horizon now, and the view is wider than it was before. Take what's useful, leave what's not, but don't leave it all behind. Some of this will return to you when you least expect it, in a conversation, in a decision, in a moment of doubt. And when it does, you'll recognize it, not as something external, something you were taught, but as something you've come to understand for yourself. That's all this was ever meant to be. Not instruction, not persuasion, just an invitation to think more carefully, more broadly, more honestly about the world and your place in it. The invitation remains open. The questions remain open. And you remain open, capable of growth, capable of change, capable of seeing what you couldn't see before. Thank you for watching. For more engaging and though provoking videos like this, have a look on our channel right now, leave a comment about what you think and what else you would like to fall asleep to on this channel.